Good morning. My name is Krystal Tsosie, and I'll be presenting on behalf of myself, Kiela Fox, and Joseph Irasheta as part of the Native Biodata Consortium. The title of this presentation is Models of Data Governance and Advancing Indigenous Genomic Data Sovereignty. Yate, that's how you say hello in my native language, which is Dinepazad, which is the language of my people, or the Dine, which is, as you guys know, the Navajo Nation. I'm originally from Shanto, Arizona, which is indicated by the star in the map of Arizona to the left. It's located close to the Utah border, but it's also located pretty close to this beautiful scenic view that I'm sure you guys are familiar with if you watch any old or Western movies, or I think some of the recent films have Monument Valley featured. I am a geneticist and bioethicist, and I'm also a co-founder of the Native Biodata Consortium, which is the first Indigenous-led biorepository for U.S. tribes. I want to talk to you a little bit today about data governance, in particular about data governance frameworks. So I'm not sure if you're quite familiar with the field or the literature of data governance, but in my opinion, a lot of it at this point in time is still theoretical or philosophical in terms of what data governance should look like, such that the best sort of schematics for data governance frameworks have come from the corporate structure or data security companies, from which I borrowed this figure from. And I love this figure because it touches upon all the multiple aspects of data governance. And starting with, and I highlighted here, ownership, because it turns out that ownership and stewardship of data is the fundamental key aspect, in my opinion, from which all the other points are determined in terms of what types of knowledge can be extracted, the quality, security, accessibility. And it's actually this point of ownership and stewardship that I want to begin. In terms for tribes in particular, we are still sort of navigating what data governance should look like, especially within a research regulatory framework. And for us, deciding who has ownership or stewardship of data actually has led to a spectrum of potential governance structures, as many Indigenous scholars have sort of posited over the last couple of decades. So the first one is the tribal trust relationship. And as I move from left to right of this slide, just note that as we move over to the right, we're going to start seeing increasing levels of stewardship and ownership and control over data exercised by the community or Indigenous peoples to move forward. So the tribal trust relationship is what we're calling the more traditional model that we have seen in biomedical research in the past and in recent, in which an outside entity largely comprised of non-Indigenous people makes the decisions on storage, collection, and usage of data collected from tribal members. And effectively, tribal members have no or little input to this process. The middle one, as we move forward to the right, is what we're calling a non-tribal partnership, in which the tribe has some ownership or stewardship. In this case, the tribe might contract with or partner with an outside entity to assist with those aspects of data, effectively giving tribal members a little bit more control over this process. And then finally, we have what we're calling tribally driven research. And we are calling this tribally driven research as a nod to Dr. Eddie Brown from Arizona State University, who coined this term in the late 90s and early 2000s as what he conceptualized as the next step to community-based participatory research or other forms of community-engaged research, in which the tribe would have complete ownership or stewardship of the data. And in this model, the tribal members have complete and total control over processes related to data. And as I kind of want to use a couple case studies from the Southwest to sort of exemplify what I mean by models 1 and 2. So I'm going to introduce the Akma Otham, which you as non-Indigenous people might know in literature as the Pima Indians. Now, in respect to their own language, I'm going to utilize the cultural name to which the group prefers to be called, which is the Otham people. And Akama Otham actually means river people, which is appropriate because what we're describing are two different communities that reside along two rivers in central and southern Arizona. So the majority of the Akama Otham reside in two reservations. The first one is the Gila River Indian Community, or GRIC, which runs further south of Phoenix along the Gila River. And then we also have the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community, which also is south of Phoenix, but also runs a little bit to the north and also east. And the reason why people are familiar with the Otham people in biomedical research is due to the high prevalence of type 2 diabetes. Adults within the communities actually have among the highest prevalence of type 2 diabetes in the world, in that 94% or more of adults in the communities actually have type 2 diabetes. And this is largely due to a mismatch between their traditional lifestyles and the lifestyle imposed upon them. Historically, the Otham people had more of an agricultural and agrarian lifestyle and relied more on their created irrigation systems that they created to transform the desert. And they grew a lot of their own food, and their traditional diets included corn, beans, squash, lean fish. However, just very recently, by the 1900s, non-natives had diverted the tribe's water supply and have imposed a commodities and starch-rich diet, which is incompatible with their traditional ways of living. And it is now that I want to highlight this quote from the 2015 Diabetes Journal by Pearson, who wrote that the Otham have probably been the most studied group for the causes and consequences of diabetes. And this unfortunately is very true. So starting with that first model, which tribes have little to no control over data processes, I want to sort of highlight a little bit more about the GRIC community. So if you're unfamiliar with the history, the tribe actually was engaged with a 40+ year long relationship with the National Institutes of Health to study type 2 diabetes. At the beginning of this partnership, the NIH promised to help find the cause and help prevent diabetes, but the NIH actually did not start funding preventative studies until the late 1990s. And this one study in particular had about $400,000 meant to benefit the prevention of diabetes, and it was meant actually to be applied for all the, at the time, 400+ federally recognized tribes in the US. And for the Gila River Indian community and the Otham people, who have been the ones that have been the ones to actually provide the samples and who are the ones who were, at least prevalence-wise, suffering the highest rates, it seemed to them unfair that attention to prevention had been given so little detail. And furthermore, according to the Arizona Republic, the NIH actually focused a large number of its funding to studying type 1 diabetes, which doesn't even affect the Otham people and primarily affects those of European descent, calling to question for whom these studies were supposed to benefit, the people who are actually at risk and the people who are actually providing the samples and the data, or the majority population. In addition, there was just, in the tribe's opinion, sorely underfunded education efforts to actually show and teach community members how to manage their disease. There's a citation below from the Arizona Republic if you are interested. So effectively, the tribe decided that they had no input in the research processes, especially including data collected from their own members. And we know this to be true too, because a number of biomarkers collected from the Akamatham still remain in open access databases and are still heavily being used in biomedical research, even though it's been almost 20 years since the end of that relationship and that partnership with the NIH. So I really want to call to question the continued use and some would say exploitation of biomarkers collected from these studies, even though, you know, these studies have by and large ended. At this point in the early 2000s, due to proximity to major cities such as Phoenix, and also the fact that the O'odham people actually culturally have a tradition of gaming, the Gila River Indian community actually established 3 casinos on their own. And with this type of economic self-sufficiency, they were actually able to utilize the funds from those gaming efforts to create their own state-of-the-art facilities, and including their own state-of-the-art dialysis clinics. And from this period of economic growth within the tribe, especially related to health prevention, the tribe decided that they could actually do more for their own people themselves than relying on outside partners. So in response, the Gila River Indian community actually chose to end the relationship with the NIH and opt out of future studies. Now, I also want to highlight Model 2, which is where the tribe has some ownership or stewardship. And for this, I point to the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community. In 2003, they signed a $5 million agreement with Translational Genomics, which is a nonprofit research institute. Effectively, TGen came to Phoenix as part of a bid to help make Phoenix the biomedical capital of the Southwest. And, you know, the Salt River people, SRPMIC, really wanted to continue studying diabetes within the context of their community, but not necessarily with the NIH. So they further withdrew data collection with NIH and resumed the studies that interested the most, which was that of diabetes and renal carcinoma, with TGen. And in the 5 or so plus years after this agreement was signed, they had published at least 8 publications on unique biomarkers that distinguish type 2 diabetes risk in the O'odham from other ethnic groups. So for them, in this case, it was very successful in that they were able to self-direct the types of research studies that they were interested in, and also have some exercise some control over the publications that resulted. So the reason why this is able to have been done at this point in time is that TGen is not an academic institution, and being a nonprofit, they're not necessarily tied to federal funds. So acting in consultancy with the tribes effectively means that the tribes can have more of a role in these research processes. And now we see sort of a shift in the dynamic in which the researchers are now acting as a consultant to the tribes. So this is something that's very unique, and I really want to say that it's really important to note that we see tribes actually exercising more control over their data and research processes, and sort of flipping that power dynamic that we've seen historically, with the researchers being the people who are doing the research that the people want, as opposed to the other way around. So this is really fascinating. I love this case study. And then we go into tribally driven research, which the tribe has complete ownership or stewardship over all these key aspects of data. And this is like really fascinating because this gets into like Indigenous futures and what Indigenous data sovereignty could really mean for our communities. And just to do a shameless plug here, I want to highlight our organization, the NBDC, which is the nation's first Indigenous-led biological and data repository, or biobank, if you will, that's housed completely within the jurisdiction of a U.S. tribe. And what this means is that we are a nonprofit institution comprised of Indigenous scientists on an executive board, but we are also tied to the rules and regulations of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. So it means that all of our research has to be approved by the tribe. The data and oversight and governance is through the tribe, and this sort of recognition of federal sovereignty is upheld by recent changes in the Common Rule. And we're trying to take advantage of that to ensure that data and samples that are collected from tribal people have actually some control over by Indigenous people. In addition, our board members include also community members from Indigenous communities that are whose samples are banked in our repository. So just to let you know, we're located in Eagle Butte, South Dakota. And just to give you an idea of how we actually govern ourselves. So we have our board of directors, of course, and our board of advisors, which may include some non-Indigenous allies that we trust. But equal to the power and authority of the directors is actually the community advisory group. Like we actually regard this group of community members to be really integral and important for making decisions as to ensuring that the research that our institute does is actually of benefit to the communities. And I mean, who better to guide research questions than the people who are living in the communities themselves? They have the best ideas for what are the environmental components and other social socioeconomic factors might relate to disease, because they are the ones who are living these lifestyles day in and day out. So they're just so key and integral. And this is a few of our members who advise us on cultural community concerns, best practices, and meet quarterly. And we do a lot of other community engagement activities to assess this sort of feedback with members who are not affiliated with our association. But it's actually from these conversations with community members that we found that there are some potential hurdles to TDR, tribally driven research. Tribally driven research, our Model 3, which here is for this to the right, works when, you know, tribal budgets can be the ones that have adequate funds to actually create and fund a biobank for long periods of time. I mean, you have to realize that tribal nations are not the richest nations in the world. We, in addition to paying for all of our resources like education and water and electricity and everything for the general well-being of our community members, to ask them to also like create and run a biobank within the government structure is actually a huge ask, especially when at this point in time, we don't have enough Indigenous scientists. We have more Indigenous scientists than we've ever had at any point in history. Let me state that first. But we still don't have enough. So to also ask for the local tribes to also be the ones to provide the specialized training locally is really hard. And especially when funding is tied to election terms, that's difficult. So actually, it was actually the community members that gave us this other model in which a tribe might contract or partner with an outside entity. Shoot, this one's. They gave us this model for 2.5, which is a new model in which we're calling a tribal partnership, in which the tribe has complete ownership and stewardship, but by working with an Indigenous third party that works for the tribe. So this ensures confidentiality, it ensures trust, ensures full ownership of the data, but also relies on an outside entity to provide that expertise. to give effectively still tribal members have control over this process. They're just entrusting it into a native entity to take over those key aspects of governance. So with that, I'm really proud to introduce again the Native Biodata Consortium. And yeah, thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, just feel free to email me. Thank you so much.